Yeah, like I was introduced as fine. I'm looking forward for this dialogue and hope this interest people
Yeah.
creates interest.
So I also want to add that the two people additional that I have invited for inputs are Neha Ketan, who's a postdoc now in the lab. She reminded me yesterday she's not a student anymore. I think she's listening, I hope. Neha,
Yes, I'm there.
yeah, great.
Yeah, hi.
Neha was part of the mentorship team of iGEM in 2015, formal mentor. She's also a co-author on a paper that we wrote together. We will be talking a little bit about it. And the other person in the audience in the room is Tanvi, who is a fresh PhD student from our recent batch, who has worked in the past on synthetic biology of engineering microbes. Um, Maybe I'll let Neha and Tanvi say a few sentences briefly about their experiences in synthetic biology before we start. Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah, Neha.
Okay, hi. So I was a part of this IGM competition in 2015, and that was the first time we were taking part in ISO. And for me personally, it was a great experience because it allowed us to do something which is slightly different from what we usually do as a part of the PhD program. And me being a PhD student at that point of time, it was a great platform to think about an interesting problem uh, using synthetic biology tools and come up with a problem that can be addressed by a team of about 10 undergraduate students. Uh, so it was fun interacting with them. It was fun thinking, brainstorming, coming up with ideas, coming up with how exactly to proceed with a particular idea, and somehow being a mentor to the undergraduate students when you yourself are a PhD student and being trained by your supervisor. So I think it was a fun experience from scientific perspective, wherein we were thinking of a problem solution, thinking of a bigger global picture, thinking of scientific tools and methods and how exactly to communicate. At a personal level, it also gave me a chance to have interaction with my juniors, with my seniors, with my colleagues. Yeah, so I think it was a great platform, and this has few elements like it has a social outreach component into it. It has communication component into it. It has various other aspects wherein you need to arrange your own funds, sponsors. So it was a very different complete package which we usually do not get in a normal setup. And it's a good platform wherein you can think of coming out of your comfort zone, try to do something adventurous, different, which is scientifically exciting too, and can have some significant, most serious implications in the society or in the global context in general. So, yeah, I would just like to conclude saying that it was a fun experience, and I think it's one such rare occasions and a platform wherein you can have resources, you can have scientific inputs, and a lot of various social interaction along with science and with all kinds of people from all different spheres. So for me
Okay,
personally, it's a great experience. Yeah.
right. Yeah, thanks, Neha. So I think I wouldn't conclude yet because we haven't even started, but we're going to come back to some of the things you talked about. So stay here, please. We can probably spur some more pointed discussions about this, right? So I'm going to jump straight in and go to our first slide, which is just an outline of what we want to cover today. There are a lot of points here. Normally, I would argue 10 points in a short session for one day might be a bit too much, but let's see how much we can get through this without hopefully boring you. Now, before I begin, I want to ask in the audience, other than the people that are here from my lab, has any of you so far had any exposure to something this iGEM contest business?
Come on, participants, at least say no if the answer is no.
No, no, no exposure with iGEM. I mean, no.
I also heard, but I don't
Yeah.
know.
So those of you who have heard about it, thank you. Those of you who have heard about it, would you like to tell me what you think it is? I mean, Atul, I think I'm familiar with you a little bit, so I suspect you have probably, have you contemplated running it or conducting such a contest? And I think someone else also spoke, because we want to rotate the strike here a bit. Otherwise, Atul will become Ajinkya.
So I'm not saying that's what I said. I mean, just some vague plans were there, but nothing happened. So nothing from my side.
Okay. And someone else also responded. I'm sorry, I
No,
couldn't see who was-
while preparing my lecture, I came across one project on CRISPR and cannidal beacon. So that is what actually the idea I have about iGen. Not else other than that.
Thank you,
Santosh.
Santosh.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think these are very nice points that you make, because indeed, when we say the word synthetic biology, and I think many of you are active researchers who have probably seen that there are DBT calls for synthetic biology. There is funding, there is a big push from the central funding agencies to also promote it. And let us say, as instructors and teachers and guides of future scientists, most of us, I think, are aware that if we are thinking of, let us say, job-oriented training, synthetic biology is a very attractive area for people to get into in future, right? And I think Santosh's point about CRISPR is very important. So this is sort of, I mean, this is the most obvious tool that has probably revolutionized genetic engineering and genetically modified organism in the last decade or so. And the evidence is, of course, in the Nobel Prize recently awarded. So, right. Now, yeah, hi Tanvi, you're back here. So I'm going to now basically run through a bit of what iGEM is, what our experience at IISER Pune was, and then break it down into some steps which are, I hope, some kind of a to-do list, or from our perspective, that will give you a sense of what it might take were you to conduct this. Now, I will be honest with you, I do not think everyone should run an iGEM team, because there are many issues with it. And hopefully you'll see some of the pros and cons, and the decision ultimately is, as usual, your own, right? So let's get to it. So what exactly do we think is synthetic biology, and what are its maybe stated goals, or what we believe are at least supposed to be the purposes behind these kind of activities? So broadly speaking, we think of synthetic biology in the form that iGEM encourages in terms of modularity. That is to say that if I have, let us say, like Santosh was mentioning, CRISPR genes, so Cas9 genes, for instance, how do I get hold of them? How do I bring them into my lab? How do I use them? And how do I adapt them into my own project? Let us say I want to modify Leishmania to do something else, or for it to become less pathogenic and to be able to work on it in lab. I should have the ability to manipulate my genetic sequences to do this in a sensible way. The third point here is, so in a way, for me, modularity and ease of manipulation are two sides of the same coin. The third point is engineering, and this engineering is something that perhaps in a natural sciences environment we're not always familiar with. But some of you, I think, are biotechnology faculty. How many of you are actually in biotech institutes or teaching or researching in biotechnology? Maybe any of you? Yeah. Okay. So I see one hand. I don't see all the hands. In fact, I see two hands. Okay. Oh, very nice. 3, 4. Okay, things are happening. So I suspect many of you have probably obtained DNA sequences from either repositories or collaborators or people who have published work. I guarantee you that A, all those plasmids don't always work. B, those plasmids maps may not be even available to you. C, the possibility to subclone it into your own structure may not be obvious. Yeah. Now, what is it that this IGEM environment or the standardization does to enable this? So one of the things is a registry of parts. Now, the reason why this picture, which is taken, by the way, from a 2010 review by Kwok in Nature, represents is something called Lego blocks. And I think some of you at least have had the privilege of playing with these. Lego blocks, as some of you have even children who probably play with them. So Lego blocks are the epitome or the perhaps a classic example of modularity, right? You have these pieces, they have a certain number of holes, and they click onto other pieces that have so-called male and female parts or so-called indentations. And for this to actually function, the precision has to be very high. Now, if you actually go back and look at Lego's specifications, you will find that the error in manufacturing of Lego bricks is less than a millimeter. In fact, it is supposed to be about 10 microns. They have 10 micron precision in manufacturing those plastic parts. Now, it is easy to make plastic parts. It's not always easy to make genetic parts. Yeah? We talk about it in the same way with the hope that it will work in the same way, but it's not necessarily so. So you need standards, right? And one of the things that IGEM has done are standardize the way by which genetic components, plasmids, the inserts, the ability to add an insert into a structure are encoded. This also means that in the early days of IGEM, the standards involved the introduction of only 4 restriction sites, 2 upstream, 2 downstream. They were called prefix and suffix. The enzymes used were ECOR1, XBA1, PST1, and EXSP, so SPE1. The idea was that there is a directionality, so EXSP, start and stop. And there were also universal primers upstream for sequencing or amplification, right? So you essentially got now the first step in your modularity out of this whole thing. Yeah. For ease of manipulation, you also provide a set of linearized DNAs so that the merging of these structures becomes easy, and create a restriction, digestion, and ligation strategy that allows for the 3-piece assembly of larger and more complex plasmids in a stepwise manner, right? The engineering part gets to be a little more interesting, because let us say tomorrow I want to build a better spectrometer, right? I obviously, for the spectrometry, I need to know the physics that the spectrometry undergoes, that it requires, which basically means some amount of optics, some amount of electronics, some amount of mechanics for putting all of these things together. But I also need to know the application. And usually there are some equations that illustrate how these structures and their components work. So in the IGEM flavor of synthetic biology, the engineering aspect involves not just making things with genetic manipulation, but also programming the predictability of the behavior, whether it be in terms of the actual genetic networks or making databases to make it easier to reach those stages. And we're going to have a little bit of time to talk about some of these things. The eventual aim is that you get novel functions out of this. Now, here's the part that is in this slide that I want to sort of emphasize a bit, which is that in 2010, there were about 1,500 parts in the registry. This registry is at igem.org. Those of you who are at a computer, all of you are at a computer, feel free to go back and look right now. I mean, I encourage you to take a look right now. The number of parts are larger now. In 2010, this was the report in Nature, 50 had failed, 200 parts had issues, which means they may or may not work. There's no clarity about this. And it's a little bit of an open question, how many of the remaining parts have been actually tested. Now, you could always argue that this sounds like a very faulty approach to make anything, right? So let me start by asking the first question, which I know this is a little bit contrived, but given the pros and cons, how much of this Lego-like analogy is hype and how much of it is reality? So Yash, maybe since you have actually worked at the bench as well as with me and as well as a mentor, and now have the distance of about a few thousand kilometers to get perspective, maybe you can tell me what you think about whether this is hype or this is real. Can we actually treat genetic sequences and engineering of genetic parts as an engineering problem? Yeah.
It can be treated to some extent like that, but as we can say, biology is an extensive field and it's just like 10 years since it started. It will take a time, like if you say, like in 2010 there were like 1500 parts each year. There's like thousands of parts being added to the repository. It will take time, like to test each and every part, but once it's tested, we will have a huge set of repository which will further accelerate our use. So there's some initial effort which needs to go in, but eventually it will lead to that.
Neha and Tanvi, any thoughts on this? So the question, I'll repeat it, is can we treat this synthetic biology in the iGEM format as an engineering problem, or are there any limits to this? Yeah.
Okay. So I'll take this. Okay. Shall I? Yeah. So yeah, as I agree with Yash to some extent that we can treat it as an engineering problem because in some sense this provides us with a tool to address the problem that we would like to tackle. For instance, if there's a problem, iGEM, the registry, the paths that they have, they are some kind of a standardized handy tools which are available, which can be used precisely as a Lego with as a Lego to construct something that we want or we desire. And but as Yash said, yeah, it's not completely perfect. It will take some time to get to that perfection, but definitely it is a good tool which can be used to address what we want.
Neha, I'm going to actually ask you, you actually trained as an engineer, right? Your bachelor's degree is an engineering degree, yes? BE, yes, or BTech, I'm not sure. Which one is it?
BE, yeah.
So from what you studied in engineering school, what makes something in terms of these kind of manipulation experiments, genetic modification experiments, what would distinguish between science and engineering in this? I mean, which feature of it would make it more like engineering? Were you to think of the ideal case of this?
Yeah, so it would be, they are specific, you could say blueprints, or there's some specific core structures which are in some sense modular, which you can, incorporate and try different combinations to have more applied utility. So the parts are there, the ingredients are there. It has to be put in the right ratio, proportion, or in combinations to get what is desired. So I think that's where the engineering part really fits in. So that's that.
Okay. Tanvi, maybe you had something to say. Yes.
No, I was going to say the same thing, but just to add to what Neha said, right proportions and right quantities will make it. But I think after that, the right assembly is also necessary. So even if we have the parts, and as long as we can have the right construction, that will be another integral part, which is something that we can compare to engineering. I think that's all I would want to add.
Okay, when you say right construction, what exactly are you implying? Are you implying reliability of the results?
Yes, and to some, yeah, also, and to some extent, okay, let's put it this way: that some part has to go after some part in order. It's like a machine, right? Since we're comparing it to engineering, it's like a machine works. So there's some order to it, and without order, there won't be functionality. So, yeah.
So if I understood you correctly, you are referring in terms of order and also Neha with regard to the order of construction or the order of functioning or both.
Both.
Okay.
And
So I'm
optimization, yeah.
yes, go on,
Hmm.
please.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to make a point here that I began with this analogy of a spectrometer. Yes. Designing and redesigning a spectrometer and building a new one, perhaps, or actually, my favorite would be redesigning a microscope, and we'll hopefully come to that in a little bit. But when we go to the laboratory and we are working with a research grade spectrometer, we really as users do not have a doubt about its functioning. In other words, we're paying a lot of money to some Germans or even some Indian companies because we expect them to always work the way we are promised that they will work, right? And this comes to a point of robustness that I think is very important. And I believe this is something that in a basic research environment, we may not necessarily always be concerned with, right? Our results are our results and we move on, we move to something else. We are not concerned with them being reproducible. We're not concerned with them being always giving out the same outcome. And this is somewhere I think where the so-called engineering aspect, along with the fact that it is a novel function and it is useful and it is manipulable and it is modular, this is something that to my mind is a very important distinction to what you would call a conventional science internship project or 6-month project or 1-year project. Yeah. Does anyone disagree with this? Because then we would need a discussion. Otherwise, I will move on. Yeah. Because I'm going to return to this robustness later. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there are no issues there, I actually have a point here which is about reproducibility, and it is a bit of a question. Yeah, anyone who has done any biology at a cellular scale, organismal scale, population scale, you know very well, in biology, getting reproducibility is an issue, and I think those of you who follow the medical literature know that in the biomedical field, the crisis of reproducibility is a real issue. Meaning to say, experimental data reported in one lab does not work in another lab. And this has to do with many different things, and we will touch upon this in a bit. But the bottom line to me is, from my studies as a science student in the 1990s, I remember this amazing discussion in the synthetic biology, systems biology course, which is that at the end of the day, if a scientific experiment or calculation is not reproducible, it's not even scientific, right? If you cannot get the same result by doing the same thing, what is the truth value of truth in that, correct? And in that sense, synthetic biology fits very well into the general framework of biology. Yeah. So while we talked about engineering, we're also coming back to the core of science. Yeah. Okay. Now, IGEM stands, by the way, for International Genetically Engineered Machines, IGEM. Yeah. Now, why machines? Because the idea is that now you don't just work with one gene, you clone one gene somewhere, you put it somewhere, you get expression, look at a gel and say, it's fine. Because the idea is to actually reprogram at a whole cell or at least a network level. Now, part of this is something that is related to the fact that we are fully aware that in a cellular system, there are very complex genetic interaction networks, there are metabolic networks, there are sensory networks in between cells, there are networks of interaction. And I think, correct me if I'm mistaken, Manali, but there have been talks about metabolic control theory in the last few days, yes?
Yes, absolutely.
So again, I said this earlier, I'm not going to touch on those. I'm going to focus on the fundamental basis that IGEM at least works with, which is more or less genetically engineered networks, which can of course lead to either metabolic outputs or sensory outputs or protein production or behave as some kind of a novel organism. Now, you can imagine like anything, like kinetic energy can be used to move a train or move a bullet. You can either transport people or kill people with it. So like that, genetic engineering and synthetic biology in particular can be used for good purposes or bad. And bad is defined a bit subjectively, but let us say if we are to think about this, in the last couple of years, the IGEM Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organization based out of Boston in the United States, and takes inputs from the larger community of practitioners around the world. They have realized that for the relevance of this international effort to be really in a direction that helps people rather than creates monsters, genetically modified organisms that could go out of control, you need some ethical goals in it. And one of the ethical goals is based on the Sustainable Development Goals, or sometimes referred to as SDGs. Yeah. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. Does anyone want to say anything about SDGs? Yash, do you want to maybe pitch in?
Yes, maybe a quick thing. So maybe like consciously or non-consciously, like most of the research lies around this SDGs. We try to see most of the research we do or things going around relate to all these things listed here. So it helps if we consciously put effort to try to help improve those things.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to actually say that go one step further. These Sustainable Development Goals, I think Yash very nicely put it, that in the past, when iGEM started in the early stages of the 2000s, they were an open-ended lab exercise, and that was it. There was no larger plan for it. But very rapidly, it has become a multinational effort. And when it becomes multinational, what is a priority in India may not be a priority in the United States, and what may be a priority in the United States may not be a priority in South America, and that may not be a priority in Southern Africa, and so on and so forth. This is obvious to all of us. SDGs are essentially a coming together of governments from or representatives of people from all countries at the United Nations platform to create a unified set of desirable goals such that the environment is not destroyed by development. This idea of development without destroying the planet we live on has become a very strong one, especially because we live in this current era called Anthropocene, right? There is an agreement now apparently amongst planetary scientists that the impact of human activity on planetary health has become substantial, that we name it after ourselves, anthropos, us humans. And in this context, the SDGs include poverty reduction, hunger reduction, health, improved education, gender equality, sanitation and water, affordable clean energy, economic growth, industrial innovation, inequality reduction, sustainable cities, communities, consumption, climate, underwater life, terrestrial life, institution building, and partnership. Now, I hope you will see in the coming slides that indeed, as Yash very nicely said, the work that is being done in the iGEM framework already kind of very nicely fit into these goals. But remember, these are goals that every country with all different interests has come together to agree on. I think this is really beautiful, because for me, this is also an indication of the fact of something that is important to me, which is that science is a universal activity. I mean, whether I do my experiment here or in Johannesburg in South Africa or wherever else, that experiment is that experiment. I mean, I can share protocols and they can do the same thing and they should get the same result. And therefore, if we have also some shared goals in terms of ethical outcomes, that might be a really desirable thing to do, which also means collaboration can increase, which is the partnership for the goals business. Okay. So in this larger context, in our iGEM projects, we have typically been focusing in IISER on good health and well-being and related so-called biomedical kind of problems. And I hope we'll see some of these things. So the standardization of parts that I was talking about is indeed in terms of what are referred to as biobricks. This term comes from the analogy to Lego bricks. Yeah, they're standardized in the sense that they have a standard prefix and suffix part sequences. They're shareable because I can put a plasmid into a filter paper and send it off to somebody. They are supposed to be reproducible, and they are definitely programmable because, as Neha very correctly pointed out, you can put things together, right? So in the IISER context, 2015, 17, and 19, from bottom to top, were the teams that were run in the institute with indeed, with my lab serving as a nucleation point and students coming to us. And perhaps, Yash, if you don't mind, you can say a little bit about how these three teams, because you were, I think, witness to all three of them, and Neha was witness and mentor of one of them, came about. Yeah. And I'm just going to go to 2015 because both of you were involved in it. I think you may recognize Yash over here on the rightmost. His beard has gone much longer, uh, but otherwise he's the same person. And I have also grown a beard, so I think beard is common apparently for men. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how we assembled this team, Yash and Neha.
So if I remember, this was like also your one of the ideas to have a IGM team, and you sent out an email recruiting students for this. And for us, like at that time, I was in my second year. It's the bachelor's second years equivalent. And looking at the IGM and what projects or what opportunities it could offer, it was a very interesting thing for me as starting as a fresh student who didn't have much of an experience in the research, and to be able to conduct its own research, own ideas in more or less open-ended way. So that year, as a student, it was a very nice entry for me into a research field.
Nice. And maybe I should ask you this because I know we never really talked about this, but uh, before you joined the team, did you actually know what it was, what it might entail?
No, as I said, I was like fresh, no experience, nothing known about research actually, but just the interest was to be able to get work on our own interesting things. That's what it was starting point for me at least.
Yeah. Yeah. So Neha, you are in this picture, I think third from left. So there's a photographic evidence you were there. Maybe you can add a few things about what you felt when you were actually going in, not yet at the end, but going in at the start of this. What were your expectations from it as a mentor, obviously?
Okay. So for me, it looked very exciting, and especially coming from engineering background, this is something very common which happens in engineering colleges. Very often, these competitions come up, which encourage students to take part in such programs wherein they can come up with their own projects and design and have something as a proof of concept. While this IGM program, at least based on their website, it looked more structured, more promising because they were not just accepting proposals and some basic work, but it was a very guided structure. So it required a team to have a mentor, required a team to have a supervisor. There was a proper funding. So it was very well structured, is what I would say. So it gave all the freedom as a person who's part of this to come up with an idea and work through it in a very systematic, structured setup. So I think this was something which looked very exciting to me when compared to the other contemporary options available to students. So my expectations definitely were much higher, and it looked more promising given the structure, not in terms of the program, but also the paths that they were offering and the entire things which were very clearly laid out as to what is expected in all fronts.
Yeah. So Neha, I must ask you this actually also as a person, I think you in already working at that time in a computational context, right, in the lab. So were there any concrete expectations that you had from this in terms of what either you will gain or you could add to your experience list, or what was your at least motivation to
Yeah.
join, other than the fact that I think I kind of convinced you, but other
So
than that.
I think it was exciting because, so again, being an institute, our work is more of basic science. So this was a very nice transition wherein we can think of an applied real life problem and come up with a solution, or at least in that direction. So I think that was the biggest motivation.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and second, so as Chandra rightly pointed out, I was more of a computational person, where synthetic biology, I would say, is something which would not really, it's not really a wet lab or it involves experiments, but it's a more like an engineered experiment maybe. So you have a goal, and then you have a systematic way of using the tools to come up and do something. So I think these two were really, yeah,
Yeah.
the most attractive thing for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Tanvi, I think you're still there, yes?
She had to load a gel. She's in the middle of an experiment. I think she
Okay,
stepped out.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's all right, no problem. Yeah, she told me about it. Yeah. So, okay, so moving on. In fact, the team actually reassembled in 2017, and this time, I think, as Yash said, I think so. I should probably say this from my perspective. As a postdoc sitting in Boston in around 2005 to I'm sorry, 2003 to 5, I did see some of these activities start up, and it had been at the back of my mind because in a place like an undergraduate institute with an emphasis on research, uh, while at the one end it is normal for students to come and intern in our labs as research project students, um, very often this also means that there is a focused project and individual project. Um, this can mean two things. One is that you learn a lot about one um, subject, which is obvious and the point of most focused research problems. But this also means that the impression is often created that science is only for the fundamental science. The goals are only limited to the laboratory, and we all know this as practicing researchers that there has to be some connection to the real world, and anyone who has written a grant knows this. And for me, it is an important factor to bring this across to young and enthusiastic students. And I think one thing you probably notice is they're always smiling. So at least in the most of them, not all. So, and I think this is the biggest motivator for us, which is to, I think, as Neha correctly pointed out, to connect the scientific, what I might hope is some kind of rigorous scientific training, along with an application, um, because it's easy to say application, as everyone knows who has done it. It's very hard to actually bring it from start to finish, correct? And teamwork can help you get there if you break it into modular parts. And this is the part where you can argue that the genetic engineering may not necessarily be as demanding as, say, in a complex cloning problem. Um, so, I guess the reason for showing you this photographic evolution is just simply to say that that over time we have evolved a protocol where we also now select students. In fact, in the last 2019 batch of students, we also ran a quiz for students to ask them what was the reason why they were even applying, because we also have a sort of upper limit, and we have found not more than 7 to 8 people at any given time in the lab can be seriously managed by a team of 2-3 faculty. So at this point in 2019, we had 2 faculty, Dr. Ornab Ghosh on the rightmost, second from right at the back row, and I were the so-called faculty mentors. And there were a bunch of PhD students who, like Neha, volunteered to help with supervising these team members. Because paramount to doing this work is something that is very obvious to all of us, and that is biosafety. Because no matter how we pitch it, firstly, to be able to even get an iGEM project running in our institute, we need to get institutional biosafety clearance, IBSC. So I know that my fellow student members may not be aware of this, but essentially the previous year, before the iGEM project is even launched, I have to sort of put in a set of papers that proposes what that project is going to be about, at least broadly. What are the set of genetic tools that we will be using, and what are our containment and disposal methodologies? That in a way tends to constrain what we're doing. And in my lab, we've been focusing with bacteria for this reason. There are labs around the world, including in IISER Tirupati and I believe some of the IITs that have been working with mammalian cells also. As far as I know, nobody has ventured into whole organisms, but there's no limit in some senses, so long as it is genetically manipulable. Because remember, the aim is to actually make a genetic network, a novel genetic functionality. What you're looking at here are just simply pictures that we had to upload on our iGEM website to demonstrate to the judging committee that indeed we had taken care of the safety measures in a laboratory setting. So left to right, top to bottom, you're looking at the so-called safety showers in case of chemical spills, the fire safety alarm, the eye wash for spillage into the eyes, and this microbial safety hoods. Along with this, we also went through a biosafety seminar, which involved explaining what are the disposal of biohazardous waste protocols in place in lab, discussing what is and is not okay for dealing with genetically engineered bacteria. And after these lectures, to also have a quiz to test the understanding. And there was a minimum cutoff. I think I put 70% and everyone passed, because I think they understood that maybe these are obvious things, but it is important to have got them down. Now, the funny part is that even after these accidents happen, they have happened, thankfully, they have been not very serious, but they have happened in our lab. And this is the one thing that is really worries me. And because we all know when we have a set of students working in a laboratory, there is always a supervisory individual or a set of people watching and making sure that the guidelines are maintained. Now, in an open-ended project, the idea is also to give the students the freedom. So how do you give freedom without training? And so for me, safety forms a bedrock of working while not damaging either themselves or the institute. Not to mention the planet, because all these GMOs or the biochemicals that we use, they must be correctly disposed of. So this is, I understand that sometimes stating the biosafety aspects can be a bit obvious, but it is critical. And it is also demanded by the iGEM committee at the end to demonstrate that you have followed these. So in fact, as a supervisor, my role is to be the person finally responsible if something happens, that it becomes my headache to take responsibility for it, and if necessary, we get barred from iGEM, right? I mean, in the worst case scenario. So this is something I really emphasize a lot, and I think if any of you are contemplating this, I would really consider it seriously. I believe we are touching at approximately 40 minutes, so I'm going to try and speed up. This is a question that always bothers me. And I think Yash very nicely said this. He had not done a lab training before, or he had not worked in a laboratory before. So how do you train people to work independently when they have never been trained before and expect them to deliver results within 6 months? Yeah, I mean, understand, please, this is, it's almost like asking a person who has never learned to read and write on their own. Yeah, I mean, so how do you do that? And some of the procedures are a boot camp and lab training, and this really requires that you have someone who can spend time in the lab on a daily basis. So if you are contemplating this, you must budget the time for it. So I don't know, those of you who are familiar with military language, boot camp is when you become a rangroot, a recruit, that is what they send you to first. They tell you to do push-ups, run around the block, and so on. So the equivalent in a molecular biology lab is to learn how to do some basic microbial cell culture, how to set up PCRs, how to run gels, how to dispose of the material, how to use the electrophoresis machine. And even before all this was begun, we do a round of every instrument they might be using, ask them to write about it and share with the supervisor, me and their PhD guides, the documentation of what they have learned from it, so that at least we have a record that we have tried from our side to make sure that they know what is going on. Now, I really have a question for the audience and maybe Yash and Neha, because they've been watching this process. How long do you think such a training should take if one is a second year bachelor student or a first year's master's student with an equivalent in biology or biochemistry kind of background? Yeah. The question is how long do you think this should require for sufficient training to be able to at least do some very basic experiments?
Are you asking the participants first? Because everybody is wondering that the other will answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I can just start. So from But I thought like there's no proper time frame, but at least there should be a one demo and one supervised experimental run on each and every type of experiment that's expected to be used. And considering it's a team project, you should always have someone around with you when you're doing the experiments if something goes wrong. That should be like from I should feel, because like there's also time limit we need to expect. It's 6 months some experiments, so that's the minimum I would say should be the criteria.
Teachers want to add something?
Okay, so I'll just add to what Yash said. I agree with him that there's no proper timeline that we can attribute to it, but and it also depends from the team that we have, because often maybe delegation really helps. So it depends how the team is working among themselves. So whether you need to show each one of them once or twice, or just doing once with them is sufficient. So it it really depends upon the team too. And I think, as Yash said, it's the best is to each time something new is done, to ensure it's very guided and supervised. That's the minimum requirement.
So I think, thanks Neha and Yash. I think I'm going to now throw this open to the members. And I think because it's anyway time for us to take a short break, I'm going to ask each of you the same question, because you all are experienced teachers. You know, I suspect some of you have more experience teaching than I have. I've been at this job for 11 and a half years. I have some thoughts about this, but I'm very curious to know what you think. The question is the following.
Did we just lose him?
I
No.
cannot hear anything.
Yeah, I think
See,
we
yeah,
probably lost
okay.
him. Meanwhile, you all can discuss this aspect. I mean, how long do you think students should undergo training, or when can you leave them unsupervised completely independently? What do you all think? You can discuss.
I think it should be a kind of, evolving iterative kind of process. Maybe, I mean, as they mentioned earlier, like a lab mentor or seniors in a lab who have been doing it for a long time, they should demonstrate the student first, then walk them through by letting them do themselves in their presence, and later on, they do it themselves, but not with so rigorous supervision, and then they do it themselves. Maybe they fail for the first time and they do it for the next time, and then they but uh, yeah, that's how it should be, but then there should be a time limit. So that's
Others, what are your thoughts?
It is depends upon the type of labs which is there. That is the main thing. Duration varies depending upon the lab conditions. So some may takes long time to learn. That's the thing.
At least for learning basic techniques, one can at least 2 months so means is essential, and maximum it can go up to 6 months to train student to do independently. That's what I feel.
I mean, ideally, the situation would be there will always be some or the other PhD students who are always around. So the most junior students will get some direct training time, And then there's always someone who is around whom they can go to for troubleshooting. But such an ideal scenario may not exist for everyone in their respective college or university. So that's why we are all discussing, I guess.
I guess molecular biology based experiment, all life sciences related faculties, I mean, they are having the molecular biology related experiment as the, integral part in as into the curriculum. So like if we see the overall training into the students, so like in case of biotechnology, the third year student can be regarded as the trained, and we can actually rely blindly onto the part one students so as to do the molecular biology related experiments. I mean, that is actually related to how the curriculum has been designed so as to do the molecular biology related experiments.
You're saying part 3 means third year BSc students?
Yeah.
Oh,
In case of biotechnology,
okay.
because they are learning the recombinant DNA technology, molecular biology right from their second year.
But
BSc.
can I do it independently? I doubt that. I mean, of course, I do not have the expertise. So I'd rather keep my mouth shut. So I actually want my friends to say something about this.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, in like my college, since like we can actually, blindly rely upon the MSc one student. I mean, who are trained in my college at least. They can efficiently do all those like molecular biology related work.
Smriti, Santosh, Amit, what do you guys think? Because we
No,
have
that is
coming on
at least in university, it's not true at all. So even MSc2 students cannot be relied on. I mean, they have to train again and again, even in the project work.
Yes,
Manali ma'am,
from the curriculum. I mean, in case of biotechnology, the course has been designed. Like that extensively. So the
Manali ma'am, I have one incident to share if you allow.
Sure, yeah.
I was in masters. I'm telling you true story. Dissertation, true story. Master's second year dissertation. I was asked to make gel. Instead of buffer, I put water in the gel. That was my first experience, independent experience. So there are two ways to look about it. Let them be independent and learn from their mistakes, or okay, first time be there. I don't know. I mean, it's personal experiences, different stories. So this actually happened with me. So I learned that either people can learn from their mistakes, or yes, if somebody is there, it's better. Resources are not wasted for the first trial at least.
I think it's also a lot person specific. So there are some undergraduate or master students who are very independent right from the start. And I think it's also a bit person specific. So I'm not very sure we can generalize it completely, but it's an interesting topic. I don't know where Chaitanya disappeared. I have to call him. Yash and Neha. Neha, are you on campus?
Yeah, I'm trying to reach him. Yeah.
Okay, can you just check
Yeah.
what happened?
I'll just go and look in his office.
yes.
I'll check what's happening.
So I hope everybody is taking this iGEM discussion, encouragingly. It's just so that you can go back to your own colleges, universities, maybe even think of participating, prepare your PG students. That would be interesting.
So this iGEM, is it in silico or a practical work also has to be shown?
Yeah, so you can ask the expert. I have never participated.
Okay.
I don't know much.
Okay.
But Yash is here, right?
Yeah.
Still?
Yes.
Yeah, please,
So,
Yash.
yes, the results are expected. At least you need to show some proof of concept. Not necessarily needs to be a wet lab project. It could be completely dry lab project consisting of simulations, but you need to have results which you can show at the end.
I didn't know it could be dry lab also. Payal, Rohan, then we can also participate.
Yes, there's like bioinformatics. There's a complete different side which just relies on information and signal processing.
Okay.
There are different subtracts in it. Like as Chaitanya mentioned, we were mostly focused on health,
Right.
There's like information, there's a hardware part, all different sides to it. They're separate for plant, people working on plant biology. botany.
Yeah, because I remember Professor Galande was just saying when he joined in the inaugural that this year's IGEM, I think, is totally dry lab for ISO training.
Yeah,
Oh.
given the COVID situation all over the world,
Yeah, because of
most of the projects were designed in such a way that
Chaitanya,
lab.
are you back?
Yes, I had a crash of my Zoom. Everything
Okay.
hanged for some reason. There's too much excitement with regard to how long it takes to train. So yeah, I think I've been listening in most of this conversation. I would like to also add to what Yash said. There is a whole series of tracks, and I think maybe Yash mentioned this, which allow you to choose which direction you're going in from the beginning. And I think this dry lab business, it is not just this year. So yes, Sanjeev is correct that this year it was only computational, theoretical, or whatever, non-experimental. But in the past, there have been people who have won gold medals. I think the NCBS team from, I seem to remember 2017 or 15, maybe even 14, maybe, Mukund Thattai's lab. They did basically a simulator and they built some tools for analysis of DNA sequences. And I think that was already enough to win them something because they did a good job. So the bottom line becomes, as usual, the same thing with any kind of research, right? You do a good job. That's the most important. And that the review by the judges is favorable in terms of the advance made, either in terms of technique or in terms of method or in terms of contribution to the area. And I can happily tell you this, that almost every lab around the world that is doing this, they also try to publish these results. Okay. So I am proud to say that our team members have been persistent with this work, and Yash is part of that. The 2015 work led to a publication only 3 years later, though, because we had to do a lot more work beyond what we initially got on a microscope device. We'll talk about it a little bit. The 17 project led to an oscillator model, which is also published work. Again, 2 more years of work and very intense work. I think Yash can attest to it. He's also co-author on that. A lot of failures in between, things that did not work out as we expected, and that was a very important lesson. And I think we know this. This is why we conduct projects for students. But I'm actually going to return to my original question, if you don't mind, to ask the audience, my dear fellow instructors, what do you think is the amount of time? Okay, maybe let's do this as a vote. Please type in your chat window, how many weeks do you think of training you would expect an undergraduate to require before you would let them to work in a lab? Yeah.
Chaitanya, I also want to remind you, you have like 20 minutes more. That's
Yeah. So I'm seeing a consensus between 2 months and 4 months. That's approximately 4 to 8 weeks. Yeah. Santosh says a week of formal training. Yeah. 6 months, in fact. So, okay. Now, molecular biology techniques, 1 month should be enough. The student is dedicated. So, I think these are very nice inputs. Thank you, all of you. And please put all your inputs. I'm going to just copy these because I'm kind of curious to keep a record of this, because I think this is itself, as I said, this was meant as a dialogue, not as a traditional seminar, because in the same spirit of open-ended research, this is an open-ended talk. So, but we'll stop at the time.
So the question, it was for undergraduate student, right?
Anything between second year and bachelor's and first year master's. So essentially, if you consider the 5 years of BS plus MS, something from second year to 4th year. Yeah. Yeah. 4 months to include repetition of failed experiments once. I think Pooja Devi Sharma makes a very important point because, in fact, this is the obvious thing that if you've never done this before, you're going to fail at the first try. And I think this is not just true of experiments. I think, Manali, you are aware. I mean, I'm sure you have some standard tutorials for students who come to your lab. And usually we do this for PhD students because we are expecting them to, achieve maybe more deeper results, more long-lasting problems. But for master's students at this, bachelor's and master's students at this level, often the idea is that the awareness of the tools, the place where you can find protocols, basic biochemistry skills are enough to start. And so in our system, we are working with 4 weeks at the very most. Yeah? And I'm being a little bit optimistic. So the boot camp was about a week of intense work. It was in the summer break. In some countries, in the UK, for instance, in particular, they take about 2 months, and that is rigorous training. But that also means you need someone dedicated to do that, because you basically have to drop everything and train these people that have come in. And it's not one person. Remember, it is 5, 6, 10 people. 5, 6, 10 people that you want to produce results at the end of the day. So keep this in mind if you ever plan this. Now with computation, I think the same thing applies, but the timelines might be slightly different. Yeah. So with regard to training, I'm going to sort of go ahead and try to speed up. Comes then the next part, which is what are we going to work on? Yeah. And now you can argue that your training should, of course, depend on what you're going to work on. But by and large, since it is genetically engineered machines, either you're doing computation or you're doing experiments, but you're going to do something related to those two things. So your training, that part, whether you're going to do computation only, is decided by the lab. I mean, this is pretty much the lab's prerogative, the privilege of the lab to decide this, the PI or the supervisor. And in some labs and some institutes, the students approach those kind of labs that are capable of hosting certain kinds of projects, right? And so either they are directly synthetic biology labs, or they are capable of training people in a large sense. They have enough space, they have enough reagents, and so on and so forth. Because remember, and I'll come to this at the end probably, this is going to be an expensive exercise if you're doing experimental work. And even with computational work, you might need some computer resources. So, because if you want this to be really sustainable work that remains for later on, especially if it is going to be either publication worthy or even more interestingly, some kind of a product. Yeah. And in terms of the brainstorming, the idea is to actually have it curiosity driven. So a lot of people, when you put undergraduates in a room, they're going to tell you things that they have either dreamt of, or, I mean, in the IISER case, often many of them have an interest in basic sciences. So they're often thinking of fundamental problems, things that they've been either exposed to in the classroom, or questions that are open, like why is DNA packed the way it is? Why are chromosomes organized the way they are? And how can you cure cancer? These are kind of very often the most popular and immediate questions that come to mind. But there are also other things about photosynthesis. Can you make synthetic photosynthesis? I mean, for me, this is like a kind of old problem. I've always wondered, but I know there are many people who've contributed to it from the chemical engineering side. Antifreeze proteins, universal blood, water treatment. I mean, this thing goes on. So I think Yash can maybe say a few words of how we narrowed down what was the process we adopted to try and get at an idea that we can work on. Yeah. Yash?
Yes, so as Alex said, if you ask undergraduate student, each one can come up with multiple crazy ideas which are curiosity driven and open-ended. And if you see at the very first point, they seem to be over ambitious. And then through a series of rounds, you need to filter them based on the research feasibility. Like, what do we know about the actual problem which we want to work on? What local expertise do we have? Do we have the necessary instrument and the PIs in our institute who could help us in that project towards achieving that goal? So like I just see here, we showed in the pyramid like structure, how those we prioritized or ranked the project as we went through this rounds of filtering. Then also comes the aspect of the social relevance, which also points to the previous point of SDGs, the sustainable goals. Like, how can we contribute to the society with this, our ambitious idea? And like continuing the same aspect, like how will it affect the people and what applications our project can have. So as you see, like as we move ahead, there was like, can we have generate universal blood, O negative, or there was the TB. India lives in TB cases. Can we have rapid TB diagnosis? So eventually we ended up selecting TB because we had much more known knowledge and the faculty is interested or having expertise to work for it. And there's always this last aspect was about the safety of the things we are going to work on. So all this we need to consider while coming up with a project.
Thanks, Yash. And I'm going to add one more thing, that throughout the process of brainstorming, actually doing the experiments, reporting them, and so on, in some senses, the social relevance has to be built into the problem. Now, it is a bit, you can always say that, how can you expect a second year student who may not have so much exposure in life to come up with something? And one of the solutions to that has been to invite people to come and talk. People who are actually working either in the area of sustainable development, in the area of healthcare, medical practitioners, diagnosticians, and to discuss some of the things that they think are interesting problems, so that ideas then can be thrown into the field that necessarily are not their own, but they may find attractive enough and fit into the genetically engineered machines context of what is going to be judged eventually in the larger international contest. Yeah. And so that then of course leads us to planning. And I think this point that Manali made about, competition, is it there or not? Even in an experimentally driven project, competition forms an important part. In fact, Yash, remind me if I'm mistaken, but in the normal conventional IGEM, isn't computational work part of a gold medal?
So we need to have projects where we go hand in hand.
So I would even add at this point that, we're this is like the Olympics of synthetic biology. Yeah. So we always say that we are here to participate, to be good sports persons, good scientists in training, but you do want to get some sense of success also. And everyone likes success, but success is judged by against your own goals. So in that sense, your goals are put, I think Neha very nicely put it is open-ended inquiry, but within a structure. And the structure is provided by actually force the team to collectively think about all of the parts of their ambitious project: experiments, computation, social relevance, lab space, instrument training, as we go along, so that the larger team can take care of parts of it. And this is where planning becomes quite important. One of the things that the structure of the IGEM contest does is that it puts a calendar on you, and this is what the circle is supposed to represent. That February, March, April, May is supposed to be to start a team and begin fundraising. I can share with you that there are typically teams in the UK and continental Europe that start the previous year in November, December. They start with selections. I think, Yash, you can tell us, when does the Delft team get?
Can I interrupt you for a minute? So if I'm not wrong, I mean, when you participate from ICER, you just have one team from ICER, right? Or you have multiple teams? And can you have multiple PIs come together to form one team with multiple students? So I'm just wondering, because you need experimental and computational. So can 2 or 3 of us like come together, gather a bunch of students and participate? I just want to understand.
So I'll answer that in two parts. I think first part of the question you said was, can there be more than one team from an institute? The answer is yes. For IISER Pune, there's only been one team at a given time, but indeed the 2020 team, which participated in the pandemic IGEM, which was in fact local, nobody went anywhere, it was all online, that was hosted by Sanjeev's lab. The previous ones were hosted by my lab. The second part of your question is a very important point about whether just one PI should be doing it or not. This is absolutely not a Rambo project. I mean, in the sense that it is encouraged and even now formally required that more than one PI are participating in the mentoring of a team. this also means 2-3 things, for those of you who are teaching in a teaching heavy program. This means that your per week or per month load on how much time you have to invest goes down, because you can't be there all the time, and there has to be a realism about this, which is also why getting PhD students. In my case, I was lucky with Neha, who was then an integrated PhD student, to participate in this process is also important. In the 2019 case, we had, I think, 4 PhD students from different labs who signed up to it. They were not my PhD students, they were people, other labs. They took permission from their supervisors, and they were all okay with it, because it was going to be little bits, maybe 1 or 2 hours every week. They can put it on their CVs. They may gain something from it, and if something really nice comes out of it, of course, then everyone is on those papers, as those cases might be, and if there's a patent or something. So in addition, multiple PIs also make sure that there is, just like in our normal research programs, we have an RAC or a thesis advisory committee. You have multiple people that the students can go and formally talk to, because as we all know, time is finite, and we can't really, if everyone is going to everyone at all times, there's a bit of chaos. So to manage this a little bit, it helps to have multiple PIs. Yeah. And Yash, maybe you want to just tell us when does Delft start its recruitment of the IGEM? When does it start the project?
Yeah, so it's like eventually ends up after the Jamboree in December.
So it's
there's
the
a
previous
Christmas. No, so so in Europe, it's like the Christmas break is big, and once now in the January, it's already the new handouts have been out for the new team already.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the things since Manali asked a very pragmatic question about practicalities, I will ask the second question, and this is part of that arrow, the green arrow, light green arrow on the upper right corner at about 1 o'clock. That is fundraising. Yeah, and this is a very important question, because all of us know that you can't do experiments without funding, and even if you're doing only a dry lab project, if some of your participation involves a registration cost that is quite steep, and the dollar to rupee ratio is it's now, I think, something like 80 or something, I don't remember, 78 probably. So this is an important aspect which is tied in with the planning. Now, one way to see it is to say that, okay, you have a plan, and then you approach funders, and then you get something. The other is that if a faculty has access to training grants, internal training grants, the DBT Star College grants, these can be used for this. In our case, we have not been able to do that. We have to basically apply to both private funders as well as Department of Biotechnology, because fortunately in the last few years, there is something called IBEC, which is, I think, Indian Bioengineering Contest, which is a call for proposals, usually comes out in February, where the undergraduate team projects, that may be bachelor's or master's, can apply with a proposal in a template, in a standard format, for a 6-month to 8-month project, including the cost of traveling if the case is in the normal case. I mean, in pandemic situations, this is of course not necessary, but in a normal case, for traveling to Boston for 1 or 2 people. So they provide money for the experimental travel and the final conference registration, and you can get a little small amount for promotional material, because like a team, you usually, enthusiastic undergraduates want something like a team logo, maybe t-shirts and whatever. So, all of these are costs, and costs are, the funding has to come from somewhere. So this is really something that is a practical requirement. And if you involve the students, at least in the part where the goals are made realistic with mentorship, then you are essentially training people in grant writing. Yeah. And I think this is a very important aspect, which we, even at a PhD student level, we spend a lot of time trying to do it. And it maybe comes later, but you prepare students for it, because after all, research is expensive, and unless the public agrees, taxpayer agrees to put money into it, it's not going to happen. So I think I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to go a little faster. Start the wet lab, run experiments, finish experiments, document it. Wiki is the documentation method, and do them. And I just want to say this with an example of an unpublished study at the moment from our lab, from IGEM 2015, that even though we planned all this, we did experiments, we were trying to make a genetic oscillator, the bottom line is that the DNA parts needed to be sequenced. And when we sequenced them, we found that the shareable, this is an open source project, right? You do an experiment, you send the parts, the new parts that you made, the plasmids that you made back into the IGEM repository, they sequence it and put it. But sometimes errors creep in and you have to make sure that those errors are fine. And by us repeating those experiments, we are actually adding to the community knowledge. And so we found that in fact, without a genetic modification, this part was not even functioning. And this is sort of a documentation of that. There's still work in progress in the lab. Documentation itself goes through what is called a wiki. Now, those of you who everyone is familiar with what Wikipedia is, but a wiki, unlike a normal website, is a participatory documentation, which another way of saying that it is multiple people can edit the same document, and there is a version control system that ensures that one document lives there, but the contributors may be many. The website on the right-hand side is an example of one of our wikis. This has all the details of the protocols, by the way, the LB medium preparation, the buffers that we use for restriction enzymes, everything in all detail, as well as standard protocols that we followed. They may be standard from Maniatis like textbooks, but they are documented here. Because remember, if you did an experiment, you have a protocol. Now, for us, there is a two-part step to this. In an experimental lab, we're usually maintaining lab notebooks, lab journals. So that lab journal work has to be distilled into electronic online resource. And this, the moment we start doing this, becomes a continuous documentation process of what we are doing. At the time of evaluation, and I was privileged to be invited as a judge in the 2019 contest last November 2 years ago. And in the documentation provides a sense of reliability about whether the people have actually done the work themselves or they've got it outsourced. I don't know if you know this, but at least in China, there are many labs where summer students come. They have rich parents. They contract out some of the experiments, like the engineering college projects that we sometimes hear about. And those projects are done by experts somewhere else. And our job as judges is to distinguish what is done original work and what is just some kind of contracted work. And this is very important to know because this is the kind of competition that you're facing in some ways, right? And honesty is the best policy in this kind of a case, and the documentation proves it. If you remember, I mentioned at the beginning about reproducibility. One of the tracks in IGEM is a reproducibility track, which in this case, you're looking at graphs of a promoter library of DNA sequences that were combined with a GFP tag as a reporter, and they were distributed to all those teams that volunteered to participate in it. And the crux of this is the following. If the same construct is given to 10 different labs and they use the same kind of measurement, will they get the same number out of it? And you remember I mentioned this about reproducibility crisis. This is really to bring home to every student that measurements and numbers and quantification, even in biology, are important. And putting those things down already tells you how far we are from each other. So what you're looking at on the x-axis in each of these graphs are the different kinds of instruments that were used to measure fluorescence of GFP that came from a promoter construct. And this is a ratio of the strong to medium promoter strengths. The different A, B, C, D, E correspond to if I'm not mistaken, the interlab study variants, in other words, from which labs they came from. All of this is part of a publication which was put out in 2016, and there is, I think, a follow-up paper which tries to say that, in a sense, reproducibility with certain instruments is better than others. And our team was part of this publication as what is called a consortium. So many of you are familiar with these large genome consortia. It was basically a measurement that was made by us, and the data was provided to the coordinators of the consortium, and they compiled it and compared across labs what the numbers were like. And this, of course, also can vary through cell strains, because indeed we agree, at least in bacterial expression, that certain strains are appropriate for certain kinds of expression. And this also tells you in this measurement that strain dependence variability is expected. This variation is within, you can say the medians are close to each other, but it's important to know what they are. And this really establishes in some senses the instrument variability and biological variability that we can observe. There are a few more points. I'm almost out of time. Hardware, which is a track or a so-called aspect of iGEM, which we don't really normally associate with it, which is to say that, I said this at the beginning, supposing you decided to design a better spectrometer or a microscope, people have gone ahead and done it and demonstrated it using these genetic constructs that you can actually use it. Now, so this also means, we are often in many labs, in undergraduate labs in particular, many of you are familiar with this, that you don't always have the equipment that you want. But that should not constrain us from completely not being able to do experiments. If we can start to design our own instruments, and this is something that has increasingly become a community effort. So you don't have to start from scratch. You are building on what other people have done. They've put out their designs in the open source. So you can take their files, manipulate it. You need to understand, obviously, and inquire. One example is something that Yash and I were involved in. This was something familiar to many of you called Foldscope. Foldscope is a 3D print, is a paper-based microscope with a glass lens taken from commercial sources, spherical lens, and it gives you interesting magnification. In this case, the picture you're looking at is red blood cells. They're not very good, if you ask me, of a thin smear. And what we did is, when I received these Foldscopes from Manu Prakash's lab, which is the one that invented this, my biggest worry was, as a microscopist, you couldn't focus them. So we decided, let's make a focusing wheel for it. And we went through many iterations. And eventually we realized that we are not exactly physicists. So let's go and talk to the physicists. We went to Professor Umakant Rapol, who is a cold atom specialist, but he makes a lot of instruments. And he was very happy to help us. He gave us some tips. We went back. Yash became adept at making 3D printing devices. We have a 3D printer in another center. We could make these devices, and then we managed to calibrate the system to demonstrate that we can actually improve control over focus. And so, I think we did start, as Yash pointed out, with trying to make a TB diagnostic tool, but we didn't end up where we started. We ended up making improvements to microscopy itself. So your project goals and your final outcome, we know from a normal research project, is not necessarily the case, but this is undergraduate, this is open-ended, and the purpose is to actually get something new and learn in the process, not so much to necessarily publish a paper. When you do, it's a lucky happenstance. And I mentioned about computational work. This is an example of something that we had done, which was relating to the project, the experimental project, which incidentally did not work very well. But we were also at the same time staring at computational models that allow the prediction of these genetic oscillatory circuits. What you're looking at is a dual input oscillator, genetic oscillator. ARA-C is a so-called positive inducer. LACA is, as you know, the lactose repressor. The idea is that the proteins will form. They will bind to this hybrid promoter, which has a repressor and an activator site. And in the presence of inducers, arabinose and IPTG, you will have oscillations coming out of the system. What you're looking at on the right-hand side in the lower corner is the experimental data published in a paper from the lab that built this oscillator initially. And what you're looking at in the top panel A is the output of simulations that we ran with a mathematical model that took the model that was described in literature of something like 30 variables to 6 variables. Now, I don't know, those of you who are interested in mathematical modeling might find this exciting, but for us, this was very exciting because on the one hand, we can simplify the model, and simple is a good thing in mathematical modeling, right? The second part is we also managed to test what happens when we change the copy number variability, because what I did not say is that this construct that you're looking at in experimental manifestation was based on 2 different plasmids. So you could argue that their copy numbers might also vary in the cell. So oscillations, as you observe them in an experiment, may also result in terms, or may vary from sample to sample just because of copy number variability. So we asked the hypothetical question, what if we put it on the same plasmid? Would we be able to reproduce this? And so what you're looking at in the lower panels is row C, which is the copy numbers of activator repressor plasmid, the NANR, and the effect of that. And we could show that when the asymmetry is minimal, the period becomes quite small and it can go in the other direction. we also wanted to know, if we now make the plasmids a combined plasmid, can we get oscillations by simply replacing plasmid copy number with something else? So one possibility is RBS, the translation strength, or the second is RNA degradation rate, asymmetry between the activator and inhibitor. And turns out that in this case, the one of these at least is a mirror of the plasmid copy number, and degradation rate can also serve as a measure. So in fact, the degradation rate appeared to show that we could keep the two variables, amplitude and period, independent of each other. And if you want to know more, there's a paper published on the topic in PhysRev. I unfortunately cannot delve more into it because I'm actually out of time. So fundraising is always it's the least fun part about the least enjoyable part of the science, but we have to do it. And we were fortunate both initially for getting institutional support and later on corporate support, as well as the DBT IBEC initiative. So a combination of these usually gives us something. Usually, if you are thinking in terms of this, it's always better to get at least some initial seed money from the institute, because otherwise you'll be running around in circles trying to do everything at the same time. And obviously, as you know, if you don't register by a certain time, the late registration costs go up and so on and so forth. So the beauty of this whole project is that, again, highlights the international nature of the scientific exercise. There are regional meetings, there is a giant jamboree, which is the so-called international meeting. Presentation skills are required. You need to make a poster, represent the results you have obtained, documentation in terms of wiki, explaining your work to judges, which is effectively peer and expert review, networking with other teams so that maybe you help them, they help you, research related activities, outreach, social activities, which is what everyone enjoys, meeting more people, new people. And so in summary, I think this kind of an open-ended exercise in research can teach people the fundamentals of research, right? It can also be enjoyable, but it is intense. Can lead to inventions, not necessarily, and discovery, which in fact may turn out either into products in some cases, or mostly in terms of publications if they're successful. Definitely open up new collaborations, force people to look at how to raise funds, modeling to predict outcomes, teamwork to help students learn how to work together and know how to deliver on a deadline. Anything better than assignments. So I'm going to stop here now and take any questions if there are any. Yeah.
Questions?
Comments, thoughts?
So I want to like
open source.
Let's do it one at a time. Yes.
Whoever.
Yes.
Okay.
Pooja Devi,
I think
maybe, yes.
what you said, open source is the only way to go. I mean, for future of humanity in general, in terms of research, because so much is repeated, so much research is repeated, and resources do go waste. But if it is open source, yes, people can build upon it.
Pooja, I think you make a very important point, and we have to just be careful because, you know, unlike software, open source hardware and open source genetic circuits, we actually have to physically shift things from here to there, right? And this often creates logistical and other problems. So some of you are familiar with AdGene, which is a not-for-profit but commercial entity. There are efforts. So iGEM, by the way, provides 96 well plates. At the moment, I think there are 8 96 well plates worth of DNA sequences plasmids, which have been collected by the community over time at the start of your project. Not all of them work. Some of their documentation is a bit iffy. That is the challenge in a way. How do you make open source genetic networks more reliable, more robust? So I really like your comment. Yeah, thank you.
Atul?
I just want to ask, maybe I think it's quite rather really very, very important for, you know, people like us who are in the university. This is about the funding. So when you approach to, let's say, you know, corporate, and so what was your experience? I mean, do they really encourage? I know that they do definitely encourage the discussion, but when it comes to, you know, funding, so are they really open for that, this kind of, you know, endeavors?
Thanks, Atul. You raise a point that has given me pain, nightmares, and a lot of trouble. Uh, and I think that, as the role of a supervisor, that is our role. Unfortunately, the money, gathering the money. I think corporates. It's a very subjective issue. You have to approach a lot of people. There is something like 60 to 70% failure rate, and a few work out, which is exactly why the DBT IBEC is a very good initiative by the Department of Biotechnology. And I hope it sustains. I hope government finds in its heart the money to put into this in the coming years also, because we have biotechnology courses all over the country, but hands-on training is always an issue, and this is such a beautiful opportunity for hands-on training within a short, intense period. Um, so I'll also add that some international companies, yes, Bhargav, I'll just finish, and yes, some international companies, particularly the companies that we buy a lot of reagents from, Eppendorf, Merck, and I think I forget the third one. They are in Germany. Their operations, they are Germany headquartered. They traditionally support almost 10 to 20 German university teams. And in the years 2015 and 17, they were open to it. Now I think budgets have become a bit tighter. So usually the best thing is to first approach these biochemical, fine chemical companies. They are often within their corporate structures. They know this, that they know what IGEM means. They know it has a, I'm going to call it bad. I mean, it's not a very nice word, but a brand value. It has a certain seriousness to it, and so they are open to this. So those are the first ones to approach. The others, pharma companies, it's a bit tricky. I mean, you have to try, and until you try, you won't know. And this, as I said, it's a high failure rate, but it's worth trying. Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, but I think you partly answered that. Compared to India, how's the scenario in say Europe or in the US, where who funds it? Like they have a private funder, because I don't think the government grant there would have a specifically assigned to this kind of project, or maybe it could come from the individual PI's projects there. So how's the situation there?
Thanks, Atul. I'll share this with you that at least in 3 universities that I spoke to in continental Europe, the funding is very straightforward. It is part of undergraduate practical training. It's like a practical course. And so a faculty is assigned, is given credits for it. They are given a laboratory for it, and they are given funding for it. In the United States, they are very Atmanirbhar. So, which means there is no funding. They have to run around begging everyone. They sometimes get private donors. In China, very often it is the parents. So it depends. And I think one hopes that in universities, if we can convince the heads of the departments, the deans, the research advisory councils, that this is a worthwhile effort, then you may get a little bit of support. Yeah, I think Bhargav Patel had a question, and I think he has not spoken so far.
No. Actually, I wanted to add to your because see, Atul, we have already very good. We have already a good experience with Indian companies. Within this short period of time, we could connect with almost 4 major companies in India who are manufacturing certain consumables in forensic science. Right, and when we approached with them, for example, we have a very good experience with HiMedia. I think all microbiologists must be knowing about HiMedia, right? When we approached them, they will readily, ready to collaborate with our, university, and in fact, they are sending us a few instruments also free of cost for just trial basis and for validation purpose. In fact, they also collaborated for development of Make in India, for DNA fingerprinting kits and other forensically important investigation, you can say instruments and all that. Same way, the Thermo Fisher is also there. we are coming up with big news. I cannot share right now, but we are coming up with a big collaboration with Thermo Fisher. So it will be also very soon. And similarly, Bangalore Genie also we are in contact with them. So they are also going to support us in many ways. So even Zydus Cadila, other companies are also there. If you thoroughly go with them and if you pinpoint what is the necessity and what is the actual, you have to show their interest. Then and then only they will come. Otherwise, they will not come. Right. So application part, you have to show them. They will not fund in basic research. Right. So that is the scenario.
Thank you for the comment, Bhargav. I think it sounds very encouraging, and I'm sure in future more of these kind of efforts can probably be supported. I'll just say this one thing that as every one of us knows, an open-ended exploratory project, even if it has applications, doesn't guarantee deliverables, right? I mean, this is the problematic part, and I think we should be aware of this because over-promising can be a bit of a problem, and we don't want to get there because when you sign a contract with a company and they expect a certain deliverable, this is a slightly different game altogether, because at the end of the day, I must insist that while the goals of iGEM are very noble, the fundamental lesson for me is that they are a very good training platform. They can be more, but this outcome is not certain, right? This is what I meant by open-ended in that sense. That is why we, in a way, need some people to trust us, and for that you have to knock on a lot of doors before you get there. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop now, Manali, because I think she's getting very.
So I think we'll wrap it up now. And thank you so much, Chaitanya, Yash, Neha, and Tanvi, for this interactive session and walking us through all the steps that one requires to actually come up to speed and participate in such competitions. Hopefully, many of us will be inspired, and this will be really, really helpful for those of us who really are. So thank you once again, and we'll end it here. So for the participants, we meet tomorrow at 10, the last day. Bye bye, everyone.
Thanks, Manali. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day. Bye bye.